Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Superannuation is a hot topic right now with plenty of talk of super reform in the not too distant future. But one part of the sector that we haven't talked a great deal about is self-managed super funds. Remember, this discussion doesn't take into account your personal circumstances. You should seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. Class, CLASS, is an Australian accounting technology company with a real focus on self-managed super funds. Tim Steele is the CEO of Class. Tim, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Sean, delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So just tell us a little bit about Class before we get into more general conversation about the super sector and SMSFs. What does Class do? How many funds do you support?
Class is a technology provider to the accounting and SMSF administration sector, and it was born out of a desire to create a tool to support accountants and administrators to more efficiently administer SMSFs. It has gone on to include additional products related to the administrations of trusts and reporting for portfolios. And we have subsequently, sort of in more recent years, acquired a business that helps accountants with their corporate compliance and entity management with ASIC dealings as well as legal documents.
Okay, so for the purposes of today, we're going to be talking about SMSFs primarily. Where is that sector up to? There's always been plenty of talk about it, and in recent years there has been discussions about how much money you should or shouldn't have before you ran your own superannuation fund. How big is it? Is it growing? Just kind of tell me where that sector's up to.
Yeah, so we've got some data. Fortunately, the industry is very good at publishing data regularly, and we get data from the ATO as well as our own analysis. So as of the end of September, based on ATO data, there were actually 603,449 SMSFs in Australia, representing about 1.1 million members, and about 26% of all superannuation assets are in SMSFs. In terms of growth, that has been really interesting. And we saw obviously quite a large spike through the COVID period in establishment of SMSFs. And I think that was probably driven by people's heightened interest in super, and early release may have played a part of that. When we look at net establishments, which is the outcome of obviously establishments and wind-ups, that's doubled certainly up until 30 June 2022 from just under 10,000 to over 20,000. And the year prior, it was just under 5,000. And so it's doubled again.
So why is that?
Well, again, we think that people are keeping SMSFs longer. The actual establishment rate, whilst it did spike temporarily, isn't materially greater than the average we've seen over time, which is about 20,000 a year of SMSFs established. What has sort of driven, I think, the net establishment rate is a 53% reduction in the number of funds that were wound up, certainly in 2022. So if you think about the year, 2020 was about 5,000, 2021 there were about 10,000 net establishments, and just over 20,000 in 2022. That was really driven by the reduction in funds being wound up.
Okay. A self-managed super fund is it's quite a serious business. I mean, I had one, established it, maybe it's 15 years ago. And I must say I wound it up and went to one of the larger funds simply because I wasn't keeping an eye on it. And this is a while ago I did it. It is very much, if you have a self-managed super fund, it isn't a set and forget play. It's something you have to keep an eye on.
Absolutely, Sean. And look, SMSFs aren't for everyone. I think that's the really important point. I mean, I think our view from the broader sector's perspective is we'd certainly like more people to be aware of the potential benefits as well as the work required to actually maintain and ensure that your SMSF is compliant. But that is perhaps a common reason why people might say, look, actually, it's more work than I expected. And actually, given my circumstances at this stage in my life, there might be better alternatives for you. We have a view that SMSFs, again, for the right people, can support you and grow with you as the complexity of your life and needs evolve over time. Interestingly, we look at our data and we publish an annual benchmark report around every September that looks at our data. We've got about 30% of the market, so just over 180,000 SMSFs that are administered on our software. So it's a statistically significant, reasonable sample size, I guess. And we reran that data and actually released that at a recent Self-Managed Super Fund Association conference. And the driver of the establishments is sort of the millennials. So we're seeing 38% of SMSFs being established in the market today, based on our data, are in fact millennials. 36% sort of Gen X, so the 45 to 54-year-olds, and sort of 25% are 55 to 74-year-olds. Now, that's pretty consistent. And in fact, the ATO data as at the end of September actually showed that 44% of new establishments were millennials, so slightly higher on average, obviously, than our data over a slightly different period. So it does show that people are younger and younger are considering SMSFs, but they obviously need to do so understanding what it means and their circumstances, and that they've got the right help support, and we would strongly encourage them to get advice.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, when you described why I wound mine up perfectly, it was just a time in life that didn't suit me, but certainly an advisor was really critical in that process. What are the advantages of having an SMSF? Why would millennials benefit from opening one up?
Well, I think I touched on it briefly, Sean, is that we think it can grow with them as their complexities change. It means if you're younger, you can get insurance earlier and you don't have to move. Your insurance remains in your SMSF fund. There may be certain investment options that are available to you inside an SMSF that are not available to you inside a public offer or APRA regulated fund, with property being perhaps the most obvious one. And look, we really think that it gives people a sense of control over time and the flexibility as needed, and the complexity of their life changes. It doesn't mean that people necessarily want to exercise that control all the time. We still see, a reasonable percentage of assets going into ETFs inside SMSFs, and they should obviously be, based on advice, reasonably diversified or appropriately diversified. But I think this sense of control that, as needed, they can adjust over time. And I think someone actually sort of shared this anecdote with me at that recently referenced SMSFA conference. The difference perhaps is a little bit like taking the bus to work every day. If you're taking the same route, you know that you can hop on and off, you can get on the bus and just take that to work, and it's quite an efficient, effective way to do that, and will achieve its objective. If perhaps you're not certain exactly where you might want to get off, if you might want to stop for a cup of coffee, maybe it makes sense to drive. And so perhaps an anecdote that might resonate with your listeners is we might see a comparison where, superannuation funds might traditionally be thought of as perhaps taking the bus, very effective, and that perhaps taking the car is sort of the SMSF comparison.
Stay with me, Tim. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Tim Steele, Chief Executive Officer of Class. So there's been lots of talk in the past couple of weeks in Canberra about potential changes to superannuation. Nothing is set in stone, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers have hinted, though, at the sustainability in terms of tax rates and that, because obviously super is very tax effective investing. 3 million seems to be this mark which keeps coming up, where the government may make changes to tax rates or tax treatment of people with high superannuation accounts. I would imagine there'd be a few self-managed super funds that would fit into that bracket.
Yes, and look, I don't think we know quite where the threshold may be, and it's certainly true, as you've described, when the government's spoken about equitable and sustainable, that you can't help but conclude that they're paving the way for the potential introduction of a cap. I think there's a lot of work and thought to go into how that would practically work, and whatever the threshold may end up being, Sean, whether it's 3 million, 5 million, or perhaps not at all. But certainly if there is a cap, then there are a number of practical issues that need to be considered. And certainly from an SSF point of view, there are a percentage of members above that threshold, and I can understand why the government's considering it, but we don't yet know how that's going to play out and what that'll mean. The challenges, for example, is if you had a higher value asset inside your SMSF that might in fact exceed whatever cap that was, how would you deal with that asset if it was a hard cap?
Yes. I mean, I think the devil will definitely be in the detail. How do people end up with that much money, though, in their super account?
Well, I think this is, and I should have probably made this point, we sort of think there's a natural conclusion to the current issue where you have these mega funds, and it's because the same restrictions that exist today, or caps that exist today, both concessional and non-concessional, didn't always exist. And so there is a natural end to these mega funds where, it'll be difficult, I think, with the current cap of 1.7 going to $1.9 million as a contribution. It will be much harder for people to get to a point where they've got a balance above $5 million, for example.
Yeah.
So it's really a short-term issue that I think, from a policy point of view, the government is seeking to deal with in considering a potential cap.
Okay. Going forward then in parking the cap rate, what else does government need to do to improve our retirement incomes system? We've had the retirement income covenant last year, and that's kind of a policy look at how people think about superannuation, particularly in the decumulation stage. Are the settings right in terms of our super system at the moment and post 65, post retirement?
Well, look, there's probably a couple of comments I can make. Firstly, I think we have a superannuation system that is the envy of the world. I mean, I think that, so we shouldn't, I think we tend to be, maybe it's Australian way, we tend to be a little bit self-critical.
No, Tim, please.
I know, Sean.
Yes,
I knock you over with a feather. But look, I know, and so we tend to be a bit self-critical, and it has continued to grow, and I think served its purpose, which is to help, offset the dependence that ageing Australians have on the age pension. And so it is serving its purpose. And I think the government, and policy and treasury continue to look at ways of making it more efficient. And so I think super has served its purpose and has done exceptionally well. So I think continuing to tinker with it, I understand the attention and potentially from a tax point of view why would do that. But the government it is working.
Tim, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much, Sean.
That was Tim Steele, CEO of Class. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Remember, this information is general in nature. You should always seek professional advice before making any investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.